21 years ago, Ann Brooks disappeared after leaving her part-time job at Miller's General Store in the small town of Cedar Falls, Kansas, never to be seen again. The 34-year-old woman, who had lost her right leg in a car accident 3 years earlier, was known throughout the community for her infectious smile and unwavering determination, despite her physical challenges. Her disappearance on that cold October evening in 2004 plunged her husband David and their 2 young children into a nightmare that would consume their lives for decades, while the tight-knit farming community of just 800 residents was left grappling with questions that seemed to have no answers. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The last confirmed sighting of Ann was at 6:47 p.m. on October 15, 2004, as she locked up the general store where she worked 3 evenings a week. Security footage from the store's single camera showed her methodically securing the building, her wooden crutch supporting her as she moved with practiced efficiency. She had called her husband David at 6:30 p.m., as was their routine, to let him know she was closing up shop and would be home in 15 minutes for dinner with their children, Emma, age 8, and Michael, age 6. The walk from Miller's General Store to the Brooks family home on Maple Street was exactly 4 blocks, a journey Ann had made hundreds of times without incident. She preferred walking when weather permitted, finding the gentle exercise beneficial and enjoying the evening conversations with neighbors who would wave from their front porches. That October evening was crisp but pleasant, with temperatures in the mid-50s and clear skies that displayed the first hints of autumn's arrival in the Kansas plains. When Ann failed to arrive home by 7:30 p.m., David Brooks began making phone calls. He first contacted the store, thinking perhaps she had forgotten something and returned, but there was no answer. Growing concerned, he loaded Emma and Michael into his pickup truck and drove the familiar route Ann would have taken, scanning both sides of the residential streets for any sign of his wife. The children pressed their faces against the windows, calling out, "Mama!" as they searched the sidewalks and front yards of their neighbors. By 8:00 p.m., David was knocking on doors throughout the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen Ann walking home. The responses were uniformly negative, despite the fact that several residents had been outside tending to their yards or sitting on their porches during the time Ann should have been walking past. This struck David as odd, since Ann was well known in the community, and her distinctive gait with the crutch made her easily recognizable from a distance. At 8:45 p.m., David Brooks called the Cedar Falls Police Department to report his wife missing. Officer Jenny Martinez arrived at the Brooks residence within 10 minutes, taking down the initial missing person report, while David's sister Sarah watched the children. Officer Martinez noted that Ann was described as a responsible mother and employee who had never disappeared before, had no history of mental health issues, and had left her purse, car keys, and all personal belongings at home that morning when she left for work. The initial search began at 9:30 p.m., with Officer Martinez and 2 volunteers from the Volunteer Fire Department retracing Ann's expected route with flashlights. They examined every sidewalk, alley, and front yard between the general store and the Brooks home, finding no trace of Ann or her distinctive wooden crutch. The crutch had been custom-made for Ann following her amputation and featured unique carved initials AMB, Ann Marie Brooks, near the handle, a detail that would become crucial years later. As word of Ann's disappearance spread through Cedar Falls that night, neighbors began gathering at the Brooks home to offer support and assistance. The community rallied around David and the children, organizing search parties and distributing hastily made flyers with Ann's photograph. Local business owner Frank Miller, Ann's employer, arrived at the house near midnight, visibly shaken and offering to do whatever he could to help find his missing employee. The first night passed without any discoveries, leaving David Brooks sitting on his front porch until dawn, staring down Maple Street and hoping to see his wife's familiar silhouette walking home with an explanation for her absence. The children, too young to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, kept asking when Mama would be back, their innocent questions piercing through the growing dread that was settling over the household. The morning of October 16, 2004, brought an expanded search effort as Cedar Falls Police Chief Robert Hammond took personal control of the Ann Brooks missing person case. Chief Hammond, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had moved to Cedar Falls from Wichita seeking a quieter life, immediately recognized that Ann's disappearance was unlike the typical missing person cases he had handled in rural Kansas. The combination of Anne's physical disability, her established routine, and the complete absence of any witnesses made this case both urgent and perplexing. By 7 a.m., Chief Hammond had contacted the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and requested assistance with search dogs and additional personnel. The official search area was expanded to include not just Anne's walking route, but also the surrounding farmland, abandoned buildings, and the Cedar Creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. Volunteers from neighboring communities began arriving throughout the morning, transforming the Brooks family crisis into a regional effort that would involve nearly 200 people over the following week. The search dogs arrived from Topeka at 10:30 a.m., accompanied by handlers from the KBI. The German shepherds were given Anne's scent from clothing in her bedroom and immediately began tracking along her expected route home. The dogs showed strong interest in the area near the intersection of Main Street and Oak Avenue, approximately 2 blocks from Miller's General Store. But the trail appeared to go cold at that location. Despite extensive searching of the surrounding area, including drainage ditches and overgrown lots, no physical evidence was recovered. David Brooks provided investigators with a detailed timeline of Anne's activities in the days leading up to her disappearance. She had maintained her regular schedule of working at the general store Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, spending her other time caring for the children and managing the household. David worked as a mechanic at Thompson's Auto Repair and typically arrived home by 5:30 p.m., giving the couple time together before Anne left for her evening shift at the store. The investigation revealed that Anne had no known enemies or ongoing disputes with anyone in the community. Her co-workers at Miller's General Store described her as reliable, friendly, and well-liked by customers. Frank Miller, the store owner, told investigators that Anne had been in good spirits during her shift on October 15th, discussing plans for Emma's upcoming birthday party, and mentioning that she and David were considering a weekend trip to visit relatives in Kansas City. Detective Susan Walsh from the KBI conducted extensive interviews with residents along Anne's walking route home. The lack of witnesses became increasingly puzzling as the interviews progressed. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, an elderly widow who lived directly on Anne's route and was known to spend her evenings watching the street from her front window, claimed she had been napping during the time Anne would have passed by. Tom and Linda Harrison, who lived across from Mrs. Peterson and often sat on their porch after dinner, said they had been inside watching television that evening. The investigation took its first significant turn when Detective Walsh interviewed the Jacobson family, who lived in the house closest to where the search dogs had lost Anne's scent. Carl Jacobson, a 45-year-old farmer, and his wife Mary initially stated they had been inside their home all evening and had not seen or heard anything unusual. However, during a follow-up interview 2 days later, Carl mentioned that he had taken his truck out around 7 p.m. to check on some equipment in his barn, which was located about half a mile from his house. This detail caught Detective Walsh's attention because Carl's timeline placed him on the roads during the exact window when Anne would have been walking home. When pressed for more specific details, Carl became defensive and claimed he couldn't remember exactly what time he had left or returned home. Mary Jacobson corroborated her husband's story, but seemed nervous during the interview, frequently looking to Carl before answering questions. Chief Hammond authorized surveillance of the Jacobson property and a more thorough background check on Carl Jacobson. The investigation revealed that Carl had been involved in a minor dispute with the city council 2 years earlier regarding zoning changes that would have affected his farming operation. Anne Brooks had attended those city council meetings as a concerned citizen and had spoken in favor of the zoning changes, putting her in opposition to Carl's interests. The search efforts continued throughout the second week of October, expanding to include abandoned wells, grain silos, and outbuildings throughout the rural areas surrounding Cedar Falls. Anne's photograph appeared in newspapers across Kansas, and the case was featured on the regional television news programs. Despite the widespread publicity and the involvement of professional investigators, no substantial leads emerged. David Brooks became increasingly frustrated with the pace of the investigation, particularly when he learned that Carl Jacobson had not been formally interviewed until 4 days after Anne's disappearance. During a heated meeting with Chief Hammond, David demanded to know why potential witnesses and suspects were not being treated with more urgency. Chief Hammond defended his department's methods, but privately acknowledged that the investigation was not progressing as quickly as he had hoped. As October drew to a close, the active search for Anne Brooks began to wind down. The massive volunteer effort that had characterized the first 2 weeks gradually diminished as people returned to their normal routines. The KBI maintained the case as an active investigation, but Detective Walsh was reassigned to other cases, while Anne's file was transferred to the Cold Case Division. For David Brooks and his children, this transition marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward accepting that Anne might never come home. The months following Anne Brooks's disappearance transformed the Brooks family home from a place of warmth and laughter into a shrine of grief and unanswered questions. David struggled to maintain normalcy for Emma and Michael while grappling with the reality that his wife had simply vanished without explanation. The children's bedtime routine became particularly difficult, as they would ask their father each night when Mama was coming home, their innocent faith in her return serving as both a source of hope and heartbreak for David. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. By spring of 2005, the active investigation into Anne's disappearance had effectively ended. Chief Hammond had retired and been replaced by Chief Patricia Moore, who inherited a filing cabinet full of cold cases, including Anne's. The new chief conducted a thorough review of the Brooks case and concluded that all reasonable investigative avenues had been explored. The case file was officially transferred to the inactive status, though it remained technically open pending new evidence. David Brooks refused to accept that the investigation was over. He spent his own money hiring a private investigator from Kansas City, former police detective Marcus Thompson, who spent 3 months in 2006 re-interviewing witnesses and examining the case file. Thompson's investigation focused heavily on Carl Jacobson, whose story about his movements on the night of Anne's disappearance contained several inconsistencies. However, without physical evidence or witness testimony, Thompson was unable to develop any actionable leads. The impact of Anne's disappearance rippled through Cedar Falls in ways that became apparent only with time. The community that had once been characterized by unlocked doors and children playing freely in the streets became more cautious and suspicious. Parents began driving their children to activities they had previously walked to, and neighbors who had once known each other's daily routines became more guarded about their comings and goings. Emma and Michael Brooks grew up carrying the weight of their mother's unexplained absence. Emma, who had been 8 when Anne disappeared, became fiercely protective of her younger brother and took on many household responsibilities that would normally fall to a parent. Michael, only 6 at the time of his mother's disappearance, struggled with behavioral issues at school and had difficulty forming attachments to the various women who attempted to provide maternal figures in his life. David Brooks never remarried, despite encouragement from family and friends who worried about his ability to raise 2 children alone while managing his grief. He converted Anne's hobby room into a home office, where he maintained detailed files on her case, corresponded with law enforcement agencies, and pursued every possible lead that emerged over the years. The room became a monument to his refusal to give up hope, filled with maps, photographs, and timelines that documented his wife's last known movements. In 2008, 4 years after Anne's disappearance, David received a phone call from a woman in Missouri who claimed to have seen someone matching Anne's description at a truck stop in Kansas City. David immediately drove to Missouri and spent 2 days investigating the lead, which ultimately proved to be a case of mistaken identity. This experience was repeated dozens of times over the years, as David chased reported sightings from Oklahoma to Colorado, each one ending in disappointment, but never diminishing his determination to find answers. The Jacobson family continued living in Cedar Falls, though their relationship with the community remained strained. Carl Jacobson's farming operation expanded significantly in the years following Anne's disappearance as he purchased additional land and invested in new equipment. Some residents found this prosperity suspicious given the timing, while others attributed it to normal business growth. Mary Jacobson became increasingly reclusive, rarely participating in community events and avoiding contact with the Brooks family. Detective Walsh, who had been transferred to the KBI headquarters in Topeka, maintained unofficial contact with David Brooks and would periodically review Anne's case file when time permitted. She had never been satisfied with the inconclusive nature of the investigation and harbored private suspicions about several aspects of the case. In 2010, she attempted to convince her supervisors to authorize a more thorough investigation of the Jacobson property, but budget constraints and the lack of new evidence prevented approval of the request. The 10th anniversary of Anne's disappearance in 2014 brought renewed media attention to the case. A regional television station produced a special segment on unsolved cases in Kansas, featuring interviews with David, Emma, and Michael Brooks. The segment also included archival footage from the original search efforts and brief interviews with investigators who had worked on the case. Despite the publicity, no new leads emerged from the anniversary coverage. Emma Brooks graduated from high school in 2014 and chose to attend Kansas State University, partly to pursue her interest in criminal justice and partly to remain close enough to home to support her father and brother. She wrote her senior thesis on the psychological impact of unresolved missing person cases on family members, drawing heavily on her own experience and interviews with other families in similar situations. Michael Brooks struggled more significantly with the long-term effects of his mother's disappearance. He had difficulty maintaining relationships and frequently got into trouble at school for fighting with classmates who made insensitive comments about his family situation. David enrolled Michael in counseling, but the boy remained resistant to discussing his feelings about his mother's absence. As 2015 approached, marking 11 years since Anne's disappearance, David Brooks faced the growing realization that he might never learn what happened to his wife. However, his commitment to finding answers remained unshaken, and he continued to believe that someday, somehow, the truth about Anne's fate would finally come to light. The economic downturn of 2016 brought unexpected changes to the rural landscape of Cedar Falls, as several longtime farming families were forced to sell their properties due to mounting debt and declining crop prices. Among the most significant changes was the death of Howard Mitchell, a 78-year-old bachelor farmer who had lived alone on a 160-acre spread located approximately 3 miles southeast of town. Mitchell had been a reclusive figure in the community, known for his dilapidated buildings and reluctance to maintain his property according to county standards. Howard Mitchell's death from a heart attack in January 2016 triggered a complex legal process, as he had died interstate with no immediate family members to inherit his property. The county courthouse records revealed that Mitchell had been delinquent on property taxes for several years, and his estate was insufficient to cover his debts. After months of legal proceedings, the property was scheduled for public auction to satisfy the outstanding tax obligations and estate debts. The auction, held on a sweltering July morning in 2016, attracted a modest crowd of local farmers and real estate speculators interested in acquiring land at below-market prices. David Mitchell, a distant cousin of the deceased from Oklahoma, was the successful bidder on the main property, purchasing the 160 acres and all buildings for $47,000. David Mitchell had no previous connection to Cedar Falls and intended to clean up the property before reselling it at a profit. The new owner's first inspection of his purchase revealed the extent of neglect that had characterized Howard Mitchell's final years. The farmhouse was in severe disrepair, with a partially collapsed roof and broken windows that had allowed weather damage throughout the structure. Several outbuildings were in similar condition, including a large barn that had been constructed in the 1940s but had not been maintained for decades. David Mitchell hired a local construction crew led by Bobby Henderson to assess which buildings could be salvaged and which needed to be demolished. Henderson, a longtime Cedar Falls resident who had known Howard Mitchell peripherally, was familiar with the property's layout and history. He recommended demolishing most of the structures and starting fresh, as the cost of repairs would exceed the value of the buildings. The cleanup process began in August 2016 with the systematic removal of debris from the various outbuildings. The large barn presented particular challenges due to its size and the accumulation of decades' worth of farm equipment, old hay bales, and general refuse that Howard Mitchell had apparently used the structure to store. Henderson's crew worked methodically through the building, sorting materials that could be sold for scrap from those that needed to be hauled to the county landfill. On August 23, 2016, crew member Jake Morrison was working in the far corner of the barn, when he noticed something unusual protruding from beneath a pile of rotted hay bales that appeared to have been undisturbed for years. Upon closer examination, Morrison discovered what appeared to be a piece of carved wood with letters or symbols etched into its surface. He called Henderson over to examine the object, and both men immediately recognized it as a crutch handle. Henderson, who had lived in Cedar Falls for over 30 years, was familiar with the Ann Brooks case and immediately understood the potential significance of the discovery. The carved initials AMB were clearly visible on the wooden handle, exactly matching the description that had been circulated during the original investigation. Henderson immediately stopped work and contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department, speaking directly with Chief Moore about the discovery. Chief Moore arrived at the Mitchell property within 20 minutes, accompanied by Officer Steve Rodriguez and the department's digital camera equipment. The crutch was photographed in its original position before being carefully extracted from the hay bales and placed in an evidence bag. The condition of the wood suggested it had been in the barn for an extended period, with weathering consistent with exposure to the elements over many years. The discovery of Ann's crutch immediately reopened the investigation that had been dormant for over a decade. Chief Moore contacted the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and requested that Detective Walsh, who was still with the agency, be assigned to the case. Within 48 hours, a full forensic team was processing the Mitchell barn and surrounding property for any additional evidence related to Ann Brooks' disappearance. The forensic examination of the barn revealed several important details about the crutch's placement. The hay bales that had concealed the crutch appeared to have been deliberately stacked over it rather than randomly placed. Soil samples from beneath the hay showed traces of decomposed organic matter that warranted further analysis. Most significantly, the location where the crutch was found was not visible from the barn's main entrance, suggesting that whoever had placed it there had intended for it to remain hidden. Detective Walsh interviewed Bobby Henderson and his crew members extensively about their discovery and the condition of the barn when they began work. Henderson provided detailed descriptions of how the hay bales had been arranged and his assessment of how long they had been undisturbed. The crew's photographs of the cleanup process provided valuable documentation of the scene before the crutch was discovered. The news of the crutch discovery spread rapidly through Cedar Falls, reigniting community interest in the Ann Brooks case and raising uncomfortable questions about Howard Mitchell's potential involvement in her disappearance. Residents began recalling Mitchell's reclusive behavior and his property's proximity to the area where Ann had vanished. However, Detective Walsh was careful to emphasize that the discovery of the crutch on Mitchell's property did not necessarily implicate him in Ann's disappearance, as the item could have been placed there by someone else. David Brooks received the news of the crutch discovery through a phone call from Chief Moore on the evening of August 23rd. After 12 years of uncertainty, having a tangible piece of evidence connected to his wife provided both hope and anguish. Emma and Michael, now 20 and 18 respectively, struggled to process the implications of the discovery and what it might mean for finally learning the truth about their mother's fate. The discovery of Ann Brooks' crutch in Howard Mitchell's barn transformed what had been a cold case into an active homicide investigation, as law enforcement officials worked under the assumption that Ann's disappearance had resulted in her death. Detective Walsh established a command center in the Cedar Falls Police Department and began the meticulous process of reconstructing the timeline of events from October 2004, now with the knowledge that Ann's personal belongings had ended up on Mitchell's property. The initial focus of the renewed investigation centered on Howard Mitchell himself, who had died 7 months before the crutch discovery. Detective Walsh obtained court orders to access Mitchell's medical records, financial documents, and any available communications from the relevant time period. The investigation revealed that Mitchell had been a lifelong bachelor with no criminal record, but his reclusive nature and deteriorating mental health in his later years made him a person of interest in Ann's disappearance. Interviews with Mitchell's few acquaintances painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly paranoid and antisocial following his retirement from farming in the early 2000s. His nearest neighbor, Ruth Caldwell, told investigators that Mitchell had complained frequently about trespassers on his property and had installed multiple no trespassing signs around his land. She also recalled that Mitchell had seemed particularly agitated in the weeks following Ann's disappearance, though she had attributed this to his general mental decline rather than any specific cause. The forensic examination of Mitchell's property expanded beyond the barn to include the farmhouse, other outbuildings, and surrounding areas where human remains might have been concealed. Ground-penetrating radar was employed to search for disturbed soil or buried objects, while cadaver dogs were brought in to detect any trace of decomposition. The extensive search yielded several areas of interest, but initial excavations revealed only animal remains and old farm equipment. Detective Walsh's investigation also focused on the question of how Anne's crutch had ended up in Mitchell's barn. The timeline suggested that Anne had been attacked or abducted somewhere along her walking route home, but Mitchell's property was located 3 miles from Cedar Falls and would not have been on any logical path Anne might have taken. This geographical puzzle led investigators to consider whether Mitchell had been in town on the night of Anne's disappearance or whether someone else had transported the crutch to his property. A review of Mitchell's vehicle registrations revealed that he had owned a 1995 Ford pickup truck in 2004, which would have provided the means to transport Anne or her belongings to his property. However, Mitchell had sold the truck in 2008, and its subsequent owners had no knowledge of its history or condition during the relevant time period. The truck's current location was eventually traced to a salvage yard in Oklahoma, where it had been scrapped years earlier. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Walsh decided to re-examine the original witness statements from 2004, particularly those of residents who lived along Anne's walking route. Armed with new questions and a fresh perspective, she began conducting follow-up interviews with people who had been questioned during the initial investigation. Many of these individuals had moved away from Cedar Falls in the intervening years, requiring extensive efforts to locate and contact them. One of the most significant developments emerged from a conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the elderly widow, who had claimed to be napping during the time Anne disappeared. Now 83 years old and living in a nursing home in Topeka, Mrs. Peterson's mental faculties had declined significantly since 2004. However, during a lucid moment in her interview, she made a startling admission. She had actually been awake and looking out her window on the night of Anne's disappearance, but had been too frightened to tell investigators what she had seen. Mrs. Peterson's revelation was both tantalizing and frustrating, as her deteriorated mental condition made it impossible to obtain reliable details about her observations. She repeatedly mentioned seeing the truck and the man who shouldn't have been there, but could not provide coherent descriptions or identify specific individuals. Her adult daughter, who had power of attorney for her mother's affairs, was skeptical of the reliability of these new statements, given Mrs. Peterson's dementia diagnosis. Despite the limitations of Mrs. Peterson's testimony, her admission prompted Detective Walsh to focus more intently on the possibility that someone with a vehicle had been involved in Anne's disappearance. This theory aligned with the physical evidence, as Anne's disability would have made it difficult for a single person to overpower and transport her without some mechanical assistance. The investigation began to consider scenarios in which Anne had been forced into a vehicle rather than attacked at the location where she disappeared. The renewed focus on vehicles led Detective Walsh to re-examine the statements provided by Carl Jacobson in 2004. Jacobson's admission that he had been driving his truck around the time of Anne's disappearance took on new significance in light of the Crutch discovery and Mrs. Peterson's fragmentary testimony. Detective Walsh requested permission to interview Jacobson again, but was informed that he and his wife had moved to Colorado in 2014 and had sold their Cedar Falls property. Locating Carl and Mary Jacobson proved challenging, as they had not left forwarding addresses with local contacts and had apparently severed most ties with Cedar Falls following their departure. Detective Walsh eventually traced them to a small farming community near Colorado Springs, where Carl had purchased a cattle ranch and resumed farming operations. The couple's financial records showed that they had paid cash for their Colorado property, a transaction that raised questions about the source of their apparent wealth. The investigation into the Jacobsons' departure from Cedar Falls revealed that they had sold their Kansas property for significantly more than its assessed value to a development company based in Kansas City. The sale had occurred rapidly, with the transaction completed in less than 30 days, unusual for rural property sales that typically involve extended negotiations and inspections. The development company had subsequently resold the land at a profit, but had no records of specific interactions with the Jacobsons beyond the standard purchase documents. Detective Walsh's journey to Colorado in September 2016 represented the most significant development in the Ann Brooks case since the original investigation 12 years earlier. The 400-mile drive from Topeka to the small farming community of Woodland Creek, Colorado, where Carl and Mary Jacobson had relocated, provided Walsh with time to prepare for what she anticipated would be a crucial confrontation in the case. If this case has already caught your attention, hit the like button. It helps Ann Brooks' story reach more people. The Jacobsons' Colorado ranch was a substantial operation covering nearly 300 acres of grassland, suitable for cattle grazing, with a modern farmhouse and several newly constructed outbuildings. The property's appearance suggested significant financial investment, reinforcing Detective Walsh's questions about how Carl Jacobson had funded such an ambitious relocation and expansion of his farming operations. Public records indicated that the ranch had been purchased for $485,000 in cash, a sum that seemed inconsistent with the modest farming income Jacobson would have earned in Kansas. Detective Walsh's initial approach was to present the interview as a routine follow-up related to new developments in Ann's case, without specifically mentioning the discovery of the crutch. She was accompanied by Colorado Bureau of Investigation Agent Maria Santos, who provided local jurisdiction and additional investigative expertise. The two law enforcement officers arrived at the Jacobson Ranch on a Tuesday morning in early September, finding Carl working on fence repairs near the main road. Carl Jacobson's reaction to seeing Detective Walsh was immediate and telling. He appeared visibly nervous and asked repeatedly why investigators were interested in him after so many years. His physical appearance had changed significantly since 2004. He had gained considerable weight and developed a pronounced nervous tic that caused him to blink rapidly when stressed. Mary Jacobson emerged from the farmhouse during the initial conversation and seemed equally disturbed by the unexpected visit from law enforcement. The interview took place in the Jacobsons' living room, which was furnished expensively and decorated with artwork that seemed inconsistent with typical farming family budgets. Detective Walsh began with general questions about the couple's memories of Ann Brooks and their recollections of October 15, 2004. Both Carl and Mary maintained the same basic story they had told in 2004, though Carl's nervousness caused him to stumble over details and contradict himself on several minor points. When Detective Walsh revealed that Ann's crutch had been discovered on Howard Mitchell's property, the Jacobsons' reactions were dramatically different. Mary appeared genuinely shocked and asked detailed questions about the discovery, while Carl became withdrawn and claimed to have no knowledge of how the crutch might have ended up there. Carl's response was particularly notable because he immediately began suggesting alternative theories for the crutch's presence on Mitchell's property, despite not being asked for his opinions. The most significant development in the interview occurred when Detective Walsh asked about Carl's truck movements on the night of Ann's disappearance. In 2004, Carl had claimed he drove to his barn to check on equipment around 7 p.m. However, during the Colorado interview, he stated that he had gone to check on cattle in a pasture that was located in the opposite direction from his barn. When confronted with this discrepancy, Carl became defensive and claimed that his memory of events from over a decade ago was not reliable. Agent Santos, who had reviewed the case file prior to the interview, pointed out that Carl's 2004 statements had been quite specific about his activities and timeline. She noted that most people could remember significant details about their activities during a period when their community was dealing with a missing person case, particularly when they had been interviewed multiple times by investigators. Carl's response was to become increasingly agitated and to demand that the officers explain why they were harassing him. Mary Jacobson's behavior during the interview provided additional insights into the couple's potential involvement in Ann's disappearance. She frequently looked to her husband before answering questions, even about seemingly innocuous topics like their decision to move to Colorado. When asked about their financial situation during their final years in Kansas, Mary claimed that Carl had made successful investments in agricultural commodities, but could not provide specific details about these investments when pressed. The interview was interrupted when Carl Jacobson abruptly stood up and announced that he was not going to answer any more questions without an attorney present. This response surprised both investigators as the interview had been presented as a voluntary conversation rather than a formal interrogation. Carl's decision to terminate the interview was particularly notable because he had not been identified as a suspect and had not been given any Miranda warnings. Detective Walsh and Agent Santos spent the remainder of their Colorado visit conducting background research on the Jacobsons' activities since their arrival in the state. They interviewed neighbors, local business owners, and officials at the bank where the couple had established their accounts. The picture that emerged was of a family that had arrived with substantial cash resources but had been secretive about their background and previous circumstances. The investigation revealed that Carl Jacobson had made several large cash purchases since arriving in Colorado, including farm equipment, livestock, and home furnishings. Local bank officials confirmed that the couple had initially deposited nearly $600,000 in cash and certificates of deposit when they opened their accounts. When asked about the source of these funds, Carl had claimed they represented the proceeds from selling their Kansas property and liquidating long-term investments. However, Detective Walsh's research into the sale of the Jacobsons' Cedar Falls property revealed that they had received only $127,000 from that transaction. Even accounting for potential investment income and savings, there appeared to be a significant gap between the couple's known legitimate income sources and their apparent wealth. This financial discrepancy added another layer of suspicion to their potential involvement in Ann Brooks' disappearance. The Colorado interviews concluded with Detective Walsh and Agent Santos agreeing to maintain surveillance on the Jacobson property while pursuing additional investigation into the couple's finances and activities. Carl's refusal to continue the interview and his apparent nervousness about the questions had elevated him to the primary suspect in Ann's disappearance, though significant work remained to build a prosecutable case. The weeks following Detective Walsh's Colorado interviews marked the beginning of an intensive investigation into Carl and Mary Jacobson's financial activities and potential involvement in Ann Brooks' disappearance. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation assigned additional resources to the case, including forensic accountants who specialized in tracing suspicious financial transactions and digital specialists who could analyze electronic communications from the relevant time periods. The financial investigation revealed a complex pattern of transactions that began shortly after Ann's disappearance in 2004 and continued until the Jacobsons' departure from Kansas in 2014. Bank records showed that Carl had made a series of large cash deposits into various accounts between November 2004 and March 2005, totaling nearly $75,000. When questioned during his original interviews, Carl had attributed these deposits to the sale of farm equipment and successful crop yields, explanations that seemed reasonable at the time. However, the renewed investigation uncovered discrepancies in Carl's explanations that had not been apparent during the original case. Agricultural records from the Kansas Department of Agriculture showed that 2004 had been a particularly poor year for crop yields in the Cedar Falls area due to drought conditions. Other farmers in the region had struggled financially that year, making Carl's claims of exceptional profits highly suspicious. Detective Walsh obtained court orders to examine the Jacobsons' complete banking records from 2004 through 2014, revealing a pattern of unusual financial behavior that extended far beyond the initial suspicious deposits. The couple had maintained multiple accounts at different banks, often transferring money between accounts in amounts just below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger federal reporting requirements. This pattern suggested sophisticated knowledge of banking regulations and deliberate attempts to avoid scrutiny. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Carl Jacobson had been involved in activities that placed him in the vicinity of Ann's disappearance on October 15, 2004. Cell phone tower records, which had not been thoroughly analyzed during the original investigation, showed that Carl's phone had connected to towers along the route between his farm and Cedar Falls during the evening hours when Ann vanished. While this evidence was not conclusive, it contradicted Carl's claims that he had remained on his property that evening. Perhaps most significantly, the renewed investigation revealed that Howard Mitchell, the reclusive farmer on whose property Ann's crutch was found, had not been as isolated from the community as previously believed. Bank records showed that Carl Jacobson had made several payments to Mitchell between 2005 and 2010, ostensibly for the purchase of hay and farm equipment. However, investigators could find no evidence that these transactions had actually involved the exchange of goods or services. Detective Walsh theorized that these payments might have represented hush money, suggesting that Mitchell had knowledge of Anne's fate and had been paid to remain silent. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that Mitchell had made several large cash deposits during the same time periods when he received payments from Jacobson. The amounts involved were substantial for a retired farmer living on a modest fixed income. The investigation took another significant turn when forensic specialists completed their analysis of Anne's crutch and the surrounding area where it was discovered in Mitchell's barn. DNA analysis revealed trace amounts of blood on the crutch handle that matched Anne's blood type, though the degraded condition of the sample prevented more specific DNA matching. More importantly, analysis of soil samples from beneath the hay bales revealed the presence of synthetic fibers that appeared to match the clothing Anne had been wearing on the night she disappeared. These forensic discoveries provided the first physical evidence linking Anne's disappearance to a specific location, supporting the theory that she had been attacked and possibly killed before her belongings were transported to Mitchell's property. The presence of her blood on the crutch suggested that she had been injured during the attack, while the synthetic fibers indicated that her body or clothing had been in contact with the soil beneath the hay bales. Detective Walsh's investigation also benefited from advances in digital forensics that had not been available during the original case. Analysis of archived internet search histories from the Jacobsons' home computer revealed that Carl had conducted numerous searches related to missing person investigations, police procedures, and body disposal methods in the months following Anne's disappearance. While this evidence was circumstantial, it suggested a consciousness of guilt and familiarity with investigative techniques that would be unusual for an innocent person. The case received additional support when investigators located and interviewed several former residents of Cedar Falls who had moved away in the years since Anne's disappearance. These interviews revealed that Carl Jacobson had been more involved in community affairs than previously known, including attending city council meetings, where Anne had spoken in favor of zoning changes that would have negatively affected his farming operations. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Carl had seemed angry about the zoning issues and had made negative comments about Anne's advocacy. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Carl had been experiencing significant financial pressure in 2004, contrary to his claims of prosperity. Court records revealed that he had been behind on loan payments for farm equipment and had received several notices of default from creditors. His insurance records showed that he had significantly increased his life insurance coverage in early 2004, a decision that investigators found suspicious given his claimed financial success. By November 2016, Detective Walsh had assembled a comprehensive case that painted Carl Jacobson as the primary suspect in Anne Brooks' disappearance and probable murder. The combination of financial evidence, forensic discoveries, digital evidence, and witness testimony provided a compelling narrative of motive, means, and opportunity. However, the absence of Anne's body and the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence presented challenges for prosecution. Detective Walsh presented her findings to Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt's office, requesting authorization to seek an arrest warrant for Carl Jacobson on charges of first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide. The prosecutor assigned to review the case, Assistant Attorney General Jennifer Morrison, concluded that while the evidence was substantial, the lack of direct physical evidence linking Jacobson to Anne's death made conviction uncertain. The decision was made to continue the investigation while building additional evidence that could strengthen the case for prosecution. This approach would require patient detective work and the cooperation of Colorado authorities, but offered the best chance of achieving justice for Anne Brooks and her family after more than 12 years of uncertainty. December 2016 brought a dramatic escalation in the Anne Brooks investigation when the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, working in coordination with Colorado authorities, decided to execute search warrants on the Jacobson property and formally arrest Carl Jacobson for questioning in connection with Anne's disappearance. The decision to move forward with the arrest was influenced by new evidence that had emerged from the financial investigation and concerns that the couple might attempt to flee if they became aware of the intensifying scrutiny. The arrest operation was planned meticulously to ensure the safety of all involved parties and to maximize the potential for recovering additional evidence. Detective Walsh coordinated with Colorado Bureau of Investigation Agent Santos and a team of federal marshals to execute simultaneous search warrants on the Jacobson Ranch, their vehicles, and their financial records. The operation was scheduled for early morning hours when the couple would likely be at home and unprepared for the law enforcement response. At 6 a.m. on December 15, 2016, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles approached the Jacobson Ranch along the rural Colorado highway. The property's isolated location meant that Carl and Mary would have little opportunity to dispose of evidence or communicate with potential accomplices once the operation began. Detective Walsh had spent the previous evening reviewing her strategy for interrogating Carl, focusing on the inconsistencies in his statements and the mounting physical evidence that linked him to Anne's disappearance. Carl Jacobson was arrested without incident as he emerged from his farmhouse to begin his morning chores. The arrest warrant charged him with first-degree murder in the death of Anne Brooks, based on the totality of evidence that had been developed during the renewed investigation. Mary Jacobson was not arrested, but was detained for questioning as a potential witness and accessory to the crime. Both individuals were advised of their Miranda rights and transported to separate facilities for interrogation. The search of the Jacobson property yielded several significant discoveries that had been missed during the couple's hasty departure from Kansas 12 years earlier. In a locked storage building behind the main house, investigators found several items of women's clothing that appeared to match the description of garments Anne had been wearing on the night she disappeared. The clothing was carefully packaged for forensic analysis, though the passage of time had likely degraded any DNA evidence that might have been present. More significantly, the search revealed a detailed journal that Mary Jacobson had apparently kept throughout their marriage, including entries from 2004 that referenced Carl's increasingly erratic behavior and financial problems. One entry, dated October 20, 2004, 5 days after Anne's disappearance, described Carl as being very upset about something and noted that he had spent an entire night cleaning his truck and disposing of items that he claimed were old farm equipment. Detective Walsh's interrogation of Carl Jacobson began at 10 a.m. in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation facility in Colorado Springs. Carl had requested an attorney, but agreed to speak with investigators while waiting for legal representation to arrive. The session was recorded both audio and video, providing a permanent record of Carl's statements and demeanor during the questioning. From the outset, Carl appeared nervous and defensive, repeatedly asking why he was being charged with murder when no body had been found. The interrogation strategy focused initially on the financial evidence, presenting Carl with documentation of his suspicious banking activities and the discrepancies between his claimed income and his actual deposits. When confronted with bank records showing large cash deposits in late 2004, Carl claimed that he had been paid in cash for various farming services, but could not provide specific details about these transactions or identify the individuals who had supposedly paid him. The session took a dramatic turn when Detective Walsh presented Carl with photographs of Anne's crutch as it had been discovered in Howard Mitchell's barn. Carl's reaction was immediate and telling. He became visibly agitated and began sweating profusely, though he continued to deny any knowledge of how the crutch had ended up on Mitchell's property. When pressed about his relationship with Mitchell, Carl admitted that he had helped the old man out with some work, but claimed these interactions were purely business-related. Detective Walsh then revealed the existence of the blood evidence on Anne's crutch and the synthetic fibers that had been found in the soil beneath the hay bales. Carl's response was to become increasingly combative, accusing investigators of fabricating evidence and demanding to know why they were picking on him. His attorney arrived during this portion of the interrogation and immediately advised Carl to cease answering questions, but not before Carl had made several additional incriminating statements. The most significant moment in the interrogation occurred when Detective Walsh confronted Carl with Mary's journal entries, describing his behavior in the days following Anne's disappearance. When presented with his wife's written account of his truck cleaning activities and disposal of unspecified items, Carl's composure finally cracked completely. He began crying and muttering incoherently about not meaning for it to happen and just trying to scare her, statements that were carefully documented by the investigators present. Carl's partial admission provided the breakthrough that investigators had been seeking, though his attorney immediately intervened to prevent any further statements. The session was terminated at that point, but Carl's emotional reaction and fragmentary admissions had provided crucial evidence of his involvement in Anne's disappearance. The combination of his statements with the physical and financial evidence created a compelling case for prosecution. Meanwhile, the interrogation of Mary Jacobson was proceeding in a separate facility under the guidance of Agent Santos. Mary's questioning focused on her knowledge of her husband's activities and her journal entries that described his suspicious behavior. Initially, Mary maintained that she had no specific knowledge of Carl's involvement in any crime, claiming that her journal entries reflected general concerns about his stress and financial problems. However, when presented with the evidence that had been recovered from their property and informed of Carl's partial admissions, Mary's resolve began to weaken. She acknowledged that Carl had been different after Anne's disappearance and that she had suspected he might have been involved in something serious. Most importantly, she revealed that Carl had made several trips to Howard Mitchell's property in the months following Anne's disappearance, ostensibly to purchase hay, but returning without any agricultural products. Mary's statement provided crucial corroboration for the theory that Carl had used Mitchell's property to conceal evidence related to Anne's death. Her account of Carl's multiple visits to the Mitchell ranch, combined with the financial records showing payments to Mitchell, suggested an ongoing conspiracy to conceal the crime. While Mary did not have direct knowledge of Anne's death, her testimony about Carl's behavior and activities provided important circumstantial evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case. The arrest and partial confession of Carl Jacobson in December 2016 marked the beginning of the final chapter in the Anne Brooks case, though the path to justice would prove to be both complex and emotionally challenging for everyone involved. The combination of physical evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and Carl's own admissions created a compelling case for prosecution, but the absence of Anne's body continued to present obstacles for securing a murder conviction. Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt's office formally charged Carl Jacobson with first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide in the death of Anne Brooks. The charges were based on the theory that Carl had abducted Anne during her walk home from work, transported her to a secondary location where she died either from injuries inflicted during the attack or from deliberate murder, and then concealed her body while hiding evidence of the crime on Howard Mitchell's property. The pre-trial proceedings extended throughout 2017 as both the prosecution and defense teams prepared their cases. Carl's defense attorney, Denver-based criminal lawyer Robert Castellanos, argued that the evidence against his client was entirely circumstantial and that the prosecution could not prove Anne was actually dead, let alone that Carl had killed her. Castellanos pointed to the lack of a body, the degraded condition of the forensic evidence, and the questionable reliability of Carl's statements made under emotional duress. Prosecutor Jennifer Morrison countered by presenting the case as a classic example of circumstantial evidence that, when viewed collectively, proved Carl's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. She emphasized the financial evidence showing Carl's suspicious cash deposits after Anne's disappearance, the physical evidence linking Anne to Howard Mitchell's property, and Carl's own admissions during his interrogation. Morrison also highlighted the pattern of deception and cover-up that had characterized Carl's behavior for over 12 years. The trial began on March 15, 2018, in Shawnee County District Court in Topeka, with Judge Patricia Williams presiding. The case attracted significant media attention throughout Kansas and neighboring states, as it represented one of the most significant no-body murder prosecutions in the region's recent history. David Brooks, now 48 years old, attended every day of the trial accompanied by Emma and Michael, who had grown into young adults shaped by their mother's disappearance. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, with Detective Walsh serving as the primary witness to present the investigation's findings. Her testimony covered the discovery of Anne's crutch in Mitchell's barn, the financial irregularities in Carl's banking records, the forensic evidence linking Anne to the Mitchell property, and Carl's incriminating statements during his interrogation. The jury listened intently as Walsh described the painstaking process of building the case over more than 12 years. One of the most compelling witnesses was Mary Jacobson, who had agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Mary's testimony revealed the extent of Carl's deceptive behavior following Anne's disappearance, including his late-night absences, his suspicious financial activities, and his multiple unexplained visits to Howard Mitchell's property. Her journal entries were presented as evidence, providing contemporaneous documentation of Carl's unusual behavior. The defense case focused on attacking the reliability of the evidence and presenting alternative theories for Anne's disappearance. Castellanos argued that Howard Mitchell, who was deceased and could not defend himself, might have been responsible for Anne's death, and that Carl's payments to Mitchell represented legitimate business transactions. He also suggested that Anne might have left Cedar Falls voluntarily and that the blood on her crutch could have resulted from a minor injury unrelated to any crime. However, the defense case was severely undermined when Carl Jacobson took the stand in his own defense. Despite his attorney's advice, Carl insisted on testifying to proclaim his innocence. Under cross-examination by Prosecutor Morrison, Carl's story fell apart as he contradicted his previous statements and became increasingly agitated when confronted with the evidence against him. His emotional breakdown on the witness stand, during which he again made statements suggesting his involvement in Anne's death, proved devastating to his case. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Carl Jacobson was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide in the death of Anne Brooks. The verdict represented a victory for the prosecution's strategy of building a circumstantial case through careful investigation and forensic analysis, even without recovering Anne's body. Judge Williams sentenced Carl Jacobson to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, with additional sentences for the kidnapping and concealment charges to run concurrently. During the sentencing hearing, David Brooks was given the opportunity to address the court and speak directly to his wife's killer. His statement, delivered with quiet dignity after 14 years of uncertainty, described the devastating impact of Anne's loss on his family and his gratitude that justice had finally been achieved. Emma and Michael Brooks also addressed the court, describing how their mother's disappearance had shaped their lives and expressing their hope that other families dealing with missing loved ones would find inspiration in their mother's case. Emma, now 22 and working as a victim's advocate, announced her intention to dedicate her career to helping families navigate the challenges of unsolved cases. The resolution of Anne's case had a profound impact on the Cedar Falls community, which had lived with the uncertainty and suspicion surrounding her disappearance for over a decade. The revelation that a neighbor and community member had been responsible for the crime that had haunted the town served as a sobering reminder of how violence can emerge from unexpected sources and how appearances can be deceiving. Detective Walsh, who had spent 4 years working to solve Anne's case, reflected on the investigation as one of the most challenging and rewarding of her career. She emphasized the importance of never giving up on cold cases and the value of advances in forensic science and investigative techniques that can breathe new life into seemingly hopeless situations. Howard Mitchell's role in concealing the crime was never fully resolved, as his death prevented investigators from determining the exact nature of his cooperation with Carl Jacobson. However, the evidence suggested that Mitchell had been paid to allow his property to be used for hiding evidence, making him an accessory to the crime, even if he had not been directly involved in Anne's death. The case also highlighted the importance of financial investigations in solving complex crimes, as Carl's suspicious banking activities had provided some of the most compelling evidence of his guilt. The pattern of cash deposits and transfers that began immediately after Anne's disappearance demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt and helped establish the timeline of the crime. For David Brooks and his children, Carl's conviction provided a measure of closure after 14 years of uncertainty, though the pain of Anne's loss remained. David continued to hope that someday Carl might reveal the location of Anne's body, allowing the family to finally lay her to rest. However, Carl maintained his innocence even after his conviction and showed no indication of providing information about Anne's remains. The Anne Brooks case became a landmark prosecution in Kansas legal history, demonstrating that murder convictions could be obtained even in challenging no-body cases when sufficient circumstantial evidence was available. The case was studied by law enforcement agencies and prosecutors throughout the region as an example of how persistent investigation and modern forensic techniques could solve seemingly impossible cases. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Anne Brooks' story. We'll see you in the next video. Would you like me to adjust the tone, add more specific details to any chapter, or modify the narrative structure in any way?